ちに行ってるんで、一時的にこれを使ってます。これ。
So how do you want to? I mean, my view is just to give a very short. You know, we all need to find ways to work together. We have different perspectives on here. Yeah, I talked to.
So first, I need to.
Yeah.
では、スタートや。
Bring my list of.
それではパネルディスカッションを始めたいと。
Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to start the panel discussion. Can I ask the panelists to please move up on the stage?
Please, panelists, go to the stage.
Thank
you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Now let me introduce the panelists once again. Now, as for the CV of all the panelists, in Japan CCS Forum 2022 on the website, we have uploaded the information, so if you could please refer to the website. So I would just like to mention the name of the company, starting from Jared Daniels. We have from Mitsubishi UFJ the bank, Mr. Shimura, and we have Mr. Nemoto from the JBIC, and Dr. Sakura Nishoka from JOGMEC, and we also have Mr. Morishima from IETA, and Mr. Kobayashi from Tokyo Marine and Nichido the Fire Insurance Company, and from Mizuho Bank, Mr. Yamazaki, and two panelists from the Institute, Dr. Mohammed Abzara, as well as Dr. Shaolin Yang. So first of all, I would like to ask Ms. Shimura to raise the issues, so to speak.
Hello, everyone. Well, first of all, thank you very much. I'd like to express my sincere appreciation to Global CCS Institute for inviting me over to be a panelist among this esteemed members. Before having this panel discussion, I'd like to introduce a few of the issues that the financial institutions actually see when we finance CCS projects. Next slide, please. Now, according to the IEA's latest report, the world needs over 1,200 million tons of CCUS capacity per annum by 2030 if we were to follow the IEA's net zero emission scenario. However, as many have been already mentioned in the previous presentations, we have only about 45 million tons of commercial capacity today, or 20% of what is planned by 2030. Now, all of us who are here today know very well that we do need to accelerate the CCUS deployment. Next slide, please. Now, I've been in this industry for a long time, and as far as I understand, the technologies are there. Technologies that we need for CCUS are mature enough. And we see that there are new projects coming up, yet we're not really seeing much in Asia. China, yes, maybe, but not in Southeast Asia yet. So why not seeing enough number of operationalized projects, especially in Asia? Now, we all know that we're still struggling to establish a business model that works without any public support to begin with, especially for the CCS projects. Now, also, we may need to look into different solutions for different types of CCS projects if regulatory requirements or financial supports are not alike to each other's. And on the screen, I've just listed a few typical types of the projects. And of course, those are not the non-exhaustive. But for instance, if an operator of an upstream oil and gas project may face regulatory requirements and to reduce their CO2 or even methane emissions from the oil and gas fields. Otherwise, he or she needs to pay a penalty, then there is a strong motivation for them to invest in the CCS projects. And some companies, in addition to that, some companies may voluntarily reduce their upstream emissions due to their net zero commitments as well. And they may have a shadow price or internal carbon price to cover CCUS costs when making their business decisions as well. Now, some countries, especially in developed countries, may provide a full package of financial support to CCS projects as well. Today, we have started to see government-backed business models, especially for the CCS projects. Business environment surrounding in Asia may differ to those countries or the regions, but we can certainly learn from them and adapt some, if possible, in an Asian way. What I'm trying to say here is that financial institutions tend to look for proven technologies, proven business model that works, and companies with enough operational experiences and so forth. So we need not just the predictable cash flows, I mean that's like a minimum bottom line, but also sufficient reasoning that the said cash flows are reliable. If not, we need to find measures for de-risking. And I think this is something that we've been discussing so far. But that takes time to develop. And especially if we are dealing with projects without much of success business model cases in the world today. So from that perspective, this is my suggestion and proposal to you, to everyone, that maybe this is a time for you to use financial institutions, equity investors, or the banks as like, in a useful way so that we can together develop a business model to make the project bankable. Next slide, please. Now, I'm just borrow a slide from the GCCSI because they recently introduced the program called Southeast Asia CCS Accelerator. And because I think this is very important to even think about the business model. And so let me just briefly explain. They have 3 pillars. under which I'm not sure if pronounced correctly, SICA project. And one is a CCS regulations, 2 is enabling policy, and 3 is a geological storage. They are planning to run the project for minimum 24 months or more. And then they would have various stakeholders, both from public and the private sectors. And they focus on near-term deployment. So if we start, for the financial institutions to start thinking about financing a CCS project, first thing is, where's the risks? So first step is, I put in the slide, step 1, identifications of risk. Next slide, please. Now, I guess my previous presenter, Kobayashi-san, has already went over some of those risks, so I don't go into much of the details from here. But in fact, risk profile varies with different factors. And this is just an example, and they are not covering a full range yet. And I think there is another question, I guess, from the previous session as well, that it would be very nice to have an insurance that covers the whole value chain. Because as I mentioned on that slide in the red text, that if we start looking about financing project piece by piece, yes, we can analyze, we can conduct a due diligence, but we also need to have a due diligence for the impact given by the other activities within the value chain. So we do actually need to take into the interface risks as well. So that's another point I think is very important if we start talking about financing CCUS and de-risking CCUS projects. And I think I don't need to go over these. I mean, cash flow risk, technology risk, CO2 supply risk. CO2 supply risk, I think this has not been mentioned yet. But especially if we're going to have just a single source of CO2 and a single site, and all of a sudden the CO2 supply stops, what's going to happen in the operation? That's a huge risk that we are involving. If we're having a hub, a CCUS hub, and then we're having multiple different sources, maybe we can actually find a solution, but then the opposite side of that is that if we start collecting different CO2 from different sources, the properties are different. And for instance, the corrosion problem that may actually have in the pipeline, those additional risks that may actually borne by having different sources. So we do need to go over all these details for de-risking. Carbon credit-related risk, I think the Kobayashi-san's presentation mentioned about the pricing. Now, I would like to add also a change in the regulations for the carbon pricing too. Sometimes, and it actually happened, but if we have a long-term project and the regime changed, so as the regulations changed, and all of a sudden they actually introduced price cap where there were no price cap, then all the cash flow that we were expecting to have may actually change because of the price cap. Those are the, partially it's a regulatory risk, but it's related to the carbon credit risk as well. And of course, we have a site closing risk and the permanent issues. Next slide, please. So once that we identify risk, the second is how is these risks being treated under the CCS regulations? And especially both the financiers and insurers need to know who really is responsible for what risk. And if there are any gray areas, where's the gray areas? Is there any other way to answer or countermeasure all this gray area? So at least we do need to put everything on the table. So now we go one by one and clarify those risks. Next slide, please. So the main point for this identification of responsible parties is having to do with the liabilities. And for the liabilities, as Kobayashi-san mentioned, from the insurance point of view, as well as the financier's point of view, we have ways to deal with conventional ones. What we don't have measures is unconventional risks involved, specifically for CCUS. And Kobayashi-san already mentioned, I think it's duplicating to a certain extent what he mentioned. But for instance, a temporal operation halt due to an unexpected technical problem, even with the commercialized or proven technologies, liability issues related to CO2 leakage prior to and post-site closure, monitoring requirements, treatment of carbon credits in the case of CO2 leakage, and so forth. So all these CCUS-specific risks that are not conventional do need the answers. Who will take the responsibilities and how? Next slide, please. So once that is clear, the second, the step 3 is, are there any public support measures? And that comes in with the policy. And I think this is including the incentive package, but also various different support that we can expect from the public sector. Next slide, please. Now, I've just listed some of the examples that has been covered or introduced, at least in some of the countries. Already we talked about US with the 45Q and the IRA. And UK, now they're talking about having subsidies for utilities to begin with, and so as the CapEx coverage with many things that is involved. But when financiers think about making the project bankable, first thing we ask is, where is the revenue streams? How we can actually make money. And so this whole thing needs to be explained in the regulatory framework to a certain extent, and the incentive schemes as well. But main sources of the revenue we usually see is the CO2 capture, transportation, service fee, or payment using public support schemes from emitters, sale of carbon credits, and for the case of CCS, EOR and GR, sale of additional oil and gas recovered. So those are the main revenue streams. Now, how can we make it so that the project to be bankable? So those are the issues that needs to be clarified. Next slide, please. I just listed for the Canada, Japan, Netherlands, and Malaysia, which was already explained in the previous presentations. I guess the only thing that's not there in the previous presentation was Malaysia, where recently they introduced the tax incentives. Either it's the 100% investment tax allowance or 70% of the income tax for 10 years. And I think this is a significant commitment from the government of Malaysia to assist those CCS projects. Next slide, please. Now, this is going to be my last slide. So we do know that CCUS is critical for everyone, for the world to achieve carbon neutrality. Without it, it's not possible. We all know that. But at the same time, in order to accelerate the CCUS deployment, we do need to convince financiers and insurers to provide the capital and invest in those projects and provide insurance coverage as well. And for that, we do need the regulatory framework or something of equivalent to clarify the liability issues. So when it comes to for the future CCS projects, I have two questions that I pose, and probably it could be interesting for the benefit of time. The first one is the predictability and reliability. Those are important components of bankability. But then there are many questions that we probably need answers. My first one is, what are core elements that need to be predictable and reliable, and for how long? If we start talking about financing. And second one is, what are the most important pieces in the regulatory framework for CCUS? What are expectations for policymakers? My second point is that we start seeing different incentive schemes in the world that are available today, but then many are still newly introduced or under considerations. So where the public supports are most needed if we are going to have the CCS project here in Asia, and what may work for Asia. So those are the points I'd like to raise to the panelists. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those points and for starting our discussion here today. And again, I think, my takeaway from your short presentation is we absolutely need to find appropriate, financeable business models for CCS, right? That banks and other investors can understand, can acknowledge, can appreciate, can get appropriate risk-adjusted returns back, right? If this is to scale to the gigaton scale that is required, this CCS deployment must occur on fair financeable terms. And so, to your point, finding that business model, finding that combination of government policies that help close gaps, regulations that provide durable certainty in terms of that regulatory environment, these are all critical. There is no one-size-fits-all business model out there on a global basis. And the business model that may work on appropriate fair terms in Japan will certainly be different than a business model for China or a business model in the Middle East. Right? But from my perspective, globally, there's much commonality across these conversations and what we as the CCS community need to do, how we need to work with bankers and folks in industry, insurers, and folks to better understand what's the appropriate role of government policymakers, what's the appropriate role of banks that are leaning forward and leading, that want CCS to be part of their sustainable development portfolios, what mechanisms exist that are the most efficient and effective, again, noting that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and noting that there will be differentiated the best fits and answers from each country around the world. And so we've already heard from many of our panelists here in terms of perspective, Kobayashi, from the insurance perspective, from our colleague from JOGMEC in terms of what mechanisms JOGMEC has available, whether it's loan guarantees, whether it's equity. And so to start off this conversation, and I'd really like to have our panelists give a bit of their opinions and then turn this into a dialogue with you, the audience, and our online audience in terms of today, where we are and where those gaps remain between CCS technology performance, cost and performance now, policy certainty, durability, or questions that still remain, right? What are those key risks from a financeability perspective, from an operability perspective, from an investability perspective in CCS? What do each of our panelists see as just one key risk? And then associated with that, what do you see as the best policy tool or mechanism that can help address that risk? So, this conversation is meant to be on remaining risks and gaps and what we can all do collectively to address those. And so perhaps, since we already heard from the first panelist here, to set the scene, perhaps we could just go down to the table in just several minutes in terms of your view of what one of the key risks are from your perspective, and what do you think is the most efficient tool to address or mitigate that risk? So please, you want to start us off? Please.
Thank you for your introduction, and thank you for your presentation. This is Masaki Nemoto from JBIC. It's a very big issue and a very difficult, good question. What is the risk to accelerate commercial-based CCS projects? I'm from JBIC, it's a bank, Japan bank. So in the finance institutions, almost all risk is listed in the presentation. So I consider, I'm thinking during the presentation, I think what is the additional risk for the finance institutions? I'd like to mention about due diligence risk. Because banks, for the financial institutions, risk analysis is very important in the due diligence process. Our role is support the CCS projects, support the projects in the finance. To support the project, we have to pass the due diligence process. In the due diligence process, traditionally, finance institutions make a risk analysis based on past record, experience. That is a traditional one. However, to accelerate the CCS projects more and more, we have to focus on the forward-looking risk analysis, I think. For example, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, fired power plant, it is very bankable because of the risk analysis is based on past record. However, now we have to think about future risk and how to manage the risk at the more and more focus on the future, the forward-looking. So I would like to mention about the risk of the due diligence. For the finance institutions, we have to change the due diligence process from past record basis to the more and more forward-looking based risk analysis, I think. So that is I think that is a risk. I think if some company, some player would like to start a CCS project, have to lend the money from banks. The bank's idea, concept of how about the concept of that bank's due diligence process is very important. If that bank's due diligence process is past basis, it's a very risk for the player. However, if that bank's due diligence concept is more and more forward-looking based, it's very lucky for the player to lend the money. So I think the due diligence is process is one of the risks to accelerate CCS projects. I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And this is, one example of things that will get easier the more data that we have to work with. But, in the banks that we work with at the Institute, the funds that are at the front end leading forward, right, this clearly a key challenge. And we've heard that from a number of banks. So thank you for starting off our conversation in that regard. In terms of, from JOGMEC's perspective, what are your thoughts in terms of key risks and a policy tool that is very efficient at addressing that?
Okay. Thank you very much, Shimura-san, for listing very clearly all the risks from the standpoint of a financial institution. Well, it's true that banks cannot lend money without predictability and reliability. Well, JOGMEC's new financial scheme, which is equity investment and loan guarantee, is very effective because it will increase predictability and reliability for both banks and project developers. And I totally agree with the risks that Shimura-san mentioned. And if I add one more important risk, it is a social acceptance. Well, which I think it's also major and biggest point. Well, social acceptance it depends on where the project will be operated, and JOGMEC technically supports the process of site selection, technically, conducting survey at the geological strata and conducting site screening. Well, we provide support in this process. And together with the technical geological site selection and site characterization process, I think conducting social site characterization is critically important. Well, it's my personal point of view. Social site characterization is the idea which involves understanding of the area and seeing whether the site is suitable from a socio-economic and historical viewpoint. We don't have good tool, but actually CCS has one. Well, we can find detailed method and tool how we conduct social site characterization in GCCS's report. And in order to promote social acceptance, I think it's also important to work closely with local government to enhance predictability and reliability. Yes. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think we could have a conversation for the rest of the day and well into tomorrow in terms of social acceptance and how that impacts the deployability, the scalability of CCS is certainly a concern globally. And again, as we heard earlier in today's program from Mohammed at the end of the table, right? Great social acceptance for energy projects and projects in CCS in the Middle East. In my country, in the United States, depending on where you are, there's varying degrees of that social acceptance. And I think for the CCS community to frame the discussion of not just the risks in social acceptance, but what are the positive attributes that CCS brings in terms of what is its positive impact potential for local air quality? What is its potential for a just transition with economic benefits to the economy needs to be part of that conversation. But I fully agree that the social acceptance is a key critical risk for many technologies, including CCS. So thank you for adding that to our discussion. We had already had some conversation in terms of markets and CCS and interests in terms of shapes of the curve going forward. But from your perspective and AIDA's perspective, what do you view in terms of a key risk and a key policy that could help address that?
Thank you. Sorry.
I would like to speak in Japanese. From the IETA itself, we are involved in how to grow the international trade and transactions. So at the very end of Ms. Shimura's presentation, as one challenge in financing CCS, there was a liability issue being brought up. So in this regard, I would like to mention certain points. Now, as for IETA, when it comes to CCS, what kind of standards exist in the world, and what are the differences amongst the different standards? We are conducting study on this. We have not yet published the result, but I hope that in the near future we will be able to publish the findings. For example, offset protocol in Alberta and an American cargo registry and rare earth and so forth. There are many different standards. So what is being included in the content? What are the differences? And what are the missing elements? Well, we are right now conducting study. Now, in relation to CCS, one issue is monitoring and also permanence. The liability involving permanence, these two are where we can find the differences amongst the different standards. For countries who will be setting rules from now onwards, without these two elements, it will be quite difficult for them. On these two issues, let me start again, for monitoring and non-permanence liability. In the case of United States, as was mentioned earlier, that there are differences from country to country, but if possible, in terms of rules, we would very much like to have a common benchmark. So wherever the CCS project may be conducted, from the point of the buyer or from the point of investor, there could be the common ground whereby they can make the assessment. So from the financier's point of view, they will feel safe and secure because there are established standards and the guarantee is being made. And as for the liability issue, I believe the fences would be much lowered if there are those standards which will be in common.
Thank you for those comments, and clearly long-term liability is an issue that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Many governments around the world have been dealing with this issue. There are many lessons learned to share. I know I was involved in many conversations in the U.S. government going back almost 20 years on this topic, but clearly a topic that policy and good durable policy is absolutely required. You know, from my perspective, and that's why I asked the question earlier during your presentation on, you know, permanence, I see the issue of permanence as one of the strengths of CCS, right? Geologic storage regulations will require that one chooses safe storage sites that are permanent and secure. Monitoring, measurement, and verification will be required to ensure that permanence. And the geochemistry and the geophysics of storing CO2 in the subsurface suggests that the longer the CO2 stays in the subsurface, the more durable and permanent of a form it becomes, from injection to dissolution to ultimately forming carbonates and turning into solid form and mineralization. And so to me, from my perspective, you know, geologic storage of CO2, carbon capture and storage, the permanence aspect is a strength of CCS in terms of how it should be regarded, viewed, and you know, measured in terms of a market basis and perspective. But clearly there is work to be done in terms of long-term liability issues and again, having the regulations and that certainty that can allow investment to occur. So thank you for adding that to our discussion. Kobayashi, we heard from you already in terms of from an insurance industry perspective, but do you have any succinct, you know, maybe your top issue, maybe to add to the discussion, your top issue in terms of the highest risk from your perspective, and then your thoughts on what's the most appropriate policy to address that specific risk?
Please allow me to speak in Japanese. In the case of Japan, what is concerning is that between the government and project, the risk allocation is not clear between the project and government. Obviously, for CCS projects, this is conducted for profit generation of a company. This is part of society. So cost and responsibility as well as benefit must be appropriately shared amongst the parties. And on the part of Japanese government, in terms of subsidies, grants, and to the CCS operators, responsibility is being reflected in regulations. This is ongoing process that we appreciate. But as a next step going forward, foreseeability of investment as well as financing will be required. In the case of contingency, in the case of accident, what kind of guarantee can be acceptable for the project side will have to clarify. In the absence of such a guarantee, when accidents occur, how can it be dealt with? how can they restart after suspension, after an accident? So it would become stranded asset. There is a possibility of this occurring. So clarity in this regard is required vis-a-vis the government. They will provide the minimum safety net. But based on that, the private sector insurance companies should consider what kind of guarantee we can provide, what can be insurable. So in that order, discussions need to be had.
It brings up the question from earlier in terms of, as you move forward from single point of capture and single injection point for storage, and you move more toward a network architecture, what does that do to change that risk profile, that cross-chain risk? How does that mitigate that and make your risk less? How does it introduce different risks into that overall equation? And how can banks, look at a complex network and do the due diligence that we heard about earlier? It is an interesting question to have. We're fortunate here to have not just one, but two representatives from banks on our panel. So perhaps our next speaker can give your opinion from your perspective, please.
Thank you, Jared. So, also natural resource area, including the CCUS and voluntary carbon credit. So we'd like to also add a comment from that perspective.
So allow me to speak in Japanese from this point onward. No, Shimura-san organized our thoughts very well. Those are really very valid points that have been shared. And one by one, we have to deal with these risks, otherwise the project will not be viable. This is a network approach that will be required. So let me rephrase some of the things that was mentioned by Shimura-san. As a business, revenue and expenditure must be considered on the revenue side. The foreseeability is very important, and this has been conducted in the United States. We have to introduce that in Japan as well. It requires policy support. Now, on the expenditure side, on the other hand, average cost and risk must both be considered. If we are pursuing CCS projects, it tends to be very costly. That is a high probability. So we have to reduce that technological support, policy support to enable technology is necessary. And monitoring will also be required. Risk must be identified and dealt with because it is on the long term. Leakage is one concern. If an accident is to occur, it should not all be the responsibility of the project owners, because that will not be a viable business. So policy-wise measures will have to be introduced. So I have additional risks that I'd like to share with you in the case of CCS, especially in the area of storage. For the storage business operators, it seems that it's going to be geological storage, which means that there is uncertainty. 2D, 3D, and exploration will be required for siting. But once the storage is made after trial, drilling, whether it is viable or not is still subject to uncertainty, which means that the JOGMEC, as well as the government, have been involved in upstream risk as well. It is similar. So past experience should be brought to bear. In terms of policy formulation, CCS characteristic should be considered with the future in mind.
Thank you very much for adding that to our discussion. And it's interesting to say, how can we as an international community take advantage of all the experience and bring that forward as we try to accelerate deployment of these projects. I think globally and at the Institute, we've done our math and homework as best we can. Cumulatively, there are several 100 million tons of CO2 that have been successfully stored. And so there is much operational experience on a global basis, and there's, opportunity to bring that to help inform all of these decisions going forward in terms of what does that risk profile look like? How can we help mitigate that risk? How can we do the due diligence as efficiently and effectively as possible? So we have two other panelists here, and then Yukimi, perhaps I will come back to you to respond, and we can get a good conversation going. I'd like to actually get questions and input from the audience as well as part of this conversation, both here in the room and then online, given the expertise we have on the panel. But as I started earlier, not a one-size-fits-all solution. To find that most efficient or appropriate business model depends on which country, which region you are in, and perhaps it's even dynamic in time as we go forward and learn by doing, and the cost curves come down. Xiaoliang, could you please add from your perspective in China key risks and key policies in the Chinese context?
Sure. And thank you, George. I think I could talk about this from China's context. And as I shared with this group of audience this morning, I'm very much concerned which China could continue this momentum and eventually achieve CCUS-wide deployment by 2030 or 2040. I think the highest risk I would like to mention is technology or project scale-up risk. So now China is starting to develop all these large-scale CCUS integrated projects, like a 1.5 million ton or 10 million ton scale CCUS project. But the only the coal-power project we have now is 150K ton per year. So how can we make sure our next 1.5 million ton scale CCUS project will be successful? And we have to, without a choice, otherwise government or financial sector might lose the confidence on us. So as well as for infrastructure, so I think the infrastructure you need for like 150 ton is quite different for the 1.5 million ton. So when you hire like 30 trucks to do the 1 million ton, now you have to maybe to build the pipeline. So I think three things we need to talk about in order to mitigate the risk. One is better planning, and the second one is find a good partner, because the CCUS integrated project is very complicated and which require technology provider, EPC provider, research and design institute, and perhaps some good policy consultants or regulatory consultants. So my suggestion to Hualeng for this 1.5 million project is to identify good technology provider or equipment manufacturer provider, no matter where you come from, Japan, USA, or China. And my third tool, I think we should learn from the past. So why Kimper County IGCC project failed, and I think that could be tremendous beneficial for the new project.
Well, thank you, Xiaoliang, and I think you added a couple of data points to our conversation. I'll pick up on one that you mentioned in terms of infrastructure and infrastructure operation. And I think that is different depending on where you are regionally. In the United States, we've been doing enhanced oil recovery since 1972. There's over 8,000 kilometers of CO2 pipeline. Before the COVID pandemic, in the United States, we would move between 70 and 80 million metric ton of CO2 per annum, and that infrastructure already exists. It's interesting to think about from a risk perspective how that infrastructure builds out. For some nations, that will be onshore and pipeline, which is robust, mature technology. For others, it's yet to be seen in terms of, especially here in Japan, but in other regions, how will that shipping infrastructure be built out? What risks does that introduce to the equation? What opportunities does that risk? We've had some conversations as the Institute with other country governments in developing Southeast Asia. And the fact that if you have shipping as your modality for transport to storage in another location, that gives you flexibility that can actually help minimize or mitigate geopolitical risk if you just had a pipeline that went from one point to another, and you were fixed in terms of your business partner going forward. And so the flexibility of shipping CO2 is part of that overall transport and storage scheme is an interesting context for us. Mohammed, your thoughts from the Middle East perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Jared. I want to touch a bit on, we all have been talking about the need to move in a scale of 100 or maybe 1,000 times what we have now in the Middle East or globally. And that might come with the risk as we need to move fast, and we might have an issue with the supply chain to support the deployment of all these projects and all these larger scales. That would vary from one region to another, for example, when it comes to project permitting, how long it takes in the Middle East or another part of the world to get the permit to construct a project or a CCUS hub onshore, offshore, and so on. Do we have flexibility and easy access to supplies like cement, steel, solvents? They would require ammonia. Do we have the access into these supplies with the scale and the base that we need to build all these projects in the next 10 years or 15 years? So even we are moving into more integrated business models and hubs and clusters, we need to be aware of that risk of scale and the pressure that it will put on the supply chain. Linked to that, the pressure that it will put on the talent and the human capital. Do we have enough engineers and experts that could help in constructing these plants and later on the operation of these CCS integrated plants? Now, if we want to mitigate these risks early enough, an important element is to integrate CCS with other existing business and rely on other existing expertise and infrastructure like the oil and gas sector. And that's something, for example, a region like the Middle East, they will have the advantage of having the knowledge and the know-how. The infrastructure for the transportation and the injection in many sites is also available. But also we need on a global level to work with governments and policymakers to help putting CCS in their list of priority as a strategic projects. So permitting times can become shorter, access to resources and supplies, they can help and make CCS a priority as any other clean energy or strategic projects for the countries. I'll leave it there, thank you.
Thank you for that, and I think clearly supply chain and supply chain risk are not just focused on CCS, but I think globally, we have many concerns with that for all of what we are trying to do to help mitigate climate change. And Mohammed, I appreciate you also added to the discussion the human capital element, the fact that if we are to scale at the pace that all the math suggests that we must to be successful, the number of engineers, the number of dedicated project managers that we need just for CCS alone is quite daunting. Many of these skills are very developed and detailed skill sets. If you need regulators to do that permitting, that is a very niche skill set that takes time to develop. And so how can we globally work to make sure that does not become a rate limiting step in terms of deployment is an interesting conversation in terms of if that is a risk, what is the best policy tools, what are the best mitigation practices, education and outreach, and priming the pump for the next generation of practitioners, whether they're engineers, whether they're lawyers, whether they're geologists. It takes all of us working together to accelerate this. So we've had a number of topics here from our panelists. Thank you. Yukimi, I was wondering if you may want to respond. I don't know if you have questions, and I'd love, again, to make this dynamic and get some questions or thoughts from our audience here in the room and from online through Hiroshi as well. So Yukimi, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Jared. And assuming that the Global CCSI Institute's initiative of Southeast Asia CCS Accelerator, the SICA, works very well, and we will solve all the regulatory problems, per se, and assuming that the insurance companies are ready to insure some of the major risks involved. What's left really is how we can have enough cash flow that can cover the increasing costs. Because if we have more insurance, of course the cost increases. But then the financier need those assurance. So how can we actually have a solid income for the CCS projects, not just for short-term, long-term commitments? And the government of Japan, for instance, introduced a lot of projects and funding sources for capex, and they are now talking to begin with is for the power plants. But certainly, as Dr. Akimoto mentioned, they will consider also for the CCS projects in the future. That's very exciting and very interesting. But the world needs CCS a lot more than what we can do in the individual countries. We do need to work together, especially in Asia. And to do that, maybe it's not just the national government making commitment or tries to work out for this carbon credits, but maybe we need the huge capital, but also for the operation cash flow income as well. And for that, maybe if we can work together and have a blended finance, for instance, to invest in the project, for instance, a global or regional fund, and then that covers the capex, for instance, and so that individual countries, the governments can think about covering how to cover the operational costs and assuring the stable income for a long term. Maybe that will entice the private sectors enough to really move into commercializing the projects. Because I think we have enough demonstration projects, or we have enough funding sources putting in for the demonstration projects. Now it's really the time to think about how we can scale up and move into the commercialization. And for that, probably we need a lot more capital to put in. So that's just my...
Well, and thank you for that, and thank you for bringing our conversation full circle to, the point of from getting where we are today to the scale that's required to that gigaton scale. CCS projects need to be investable, they need to be financeable on fair commercial terms. And it's interesting, there is not a one-size-fits-all policy tool in my country and my neighbor to the north in Canada. In the North American context, we like tax credits, like the 45Q, and that seems to be an efficient and effective policy tool that is politically sustainable in the North American context, right? In other jurisdictions in Europe, they favor just a straight tax. And so when you see deployment in what is being pursued in Norway, for example, a tax on carbon is seen as a socially acceptable and very efficient policy tool. The United Kingdom has a contract for differences mechanism to make the projects investable and financially viable moving forward. And so again, not a one-size-fits-all, but clearly back to first principles, we need to make the numbers work. This has to be investable before any concrete and steel are going to get in the ground and any CO2 is going to get captured at scale. So thank all our panelists in terms of initial comments here to start our discussion. Are there questions or comments? There's one right up here. And again, I would appreciate as much engagement and interaction from our audience, both here in the room and online as possible. Please. And if you could give just your name, organization, and then your question or comment, that would be wonderful.
I am Tsukamoto from J-Call. Thank you. I would like to highly appreciate the panelists. Where lies the risk? You have made very good suggestions. It was a good educating opportunity for me. Now, if we try to sort out the risks involved, I believe all the risks have been covered and exhausted as I listened to all the panelists. But looking at the actual CCS projects, as some has suggested, from the traditional financial scheme, a risk assessment has been done on an empirical basis, but you need to be forward-looking in trying to assess the risks involved for the CCS. So you are departing from traditional process. You need to have predictability, and you need to have bankability for the projects. I would like to ask Mr. Jared Daniels, for the Institute's perspective. Worldwide, the CCS projects are growing in number. And I have heard of this many times. But are those projects only research and development or demonstrations, or are they projects on EOR basis in the oil and gas fields, or are they pure CCS projects, dedicated CCS projects? The risks which are being listed today have been assessed adequately, whereby the projects have been decided. So on such a perspective, I would like to learn from the Institute. The reason why I raise this question is, when you try to do something in your country, a certain project in the United States has these financial scheme, and it has been launched, and it is purely commercial basis, or is it that the government is doing on a demonstration basis? So government is funding 100%. There are around 40 or so projects going on around the world. But when it comes to each individual projects, we don't have detailed information yet. But such information would be indeed very valuable for us. Under the Asia CCUS network, all the countries need to share such detailed information. Then they will be able to understand more specifically and concretely what kind of financing could be made available. So I have been asking this question at length, but if there are any suggestions that you could make, please.
Thank you for that question. As the mission of the Global CCS Institute is to help accelerate deployment of CCS, according to the climate math that says it's an integral part of our overall solution. One of the ways that we do that is as a platform to share knowledge. And so all of the data that I presented earlier is available publicly on our website. There is much good data in terms of the several hundred projects globally that are going on. All of the projects in development that I mentioned, all of those data points on the map, are commercial projects that are financeable, or at least their project proponents expect to be financeable, given the regulatory landscape, the policy landscape in each of the various countries. And so, again, from the United States perspective, where I live, all of the analysis suggests that well over 100 million ton per annum is now financeable on fair commercial terms. That is based on the techno-economic performance of where the technologies are today, what the various point sources are for point source capture, what the national level policy tools are, such as the 45Q tax credit that is at $85 per ton for point source capture, or $180 per ton for direct air capture. That is taking the perspective that says you can stack, you can add federal policy tools, such as this 45Q in the US example, with state level or local level policy tools. In the case of direct air capture, the state of California has a low carbon fuel standard, which is trading on a market. It's a cap and trade program, but on a dollar per ton of CO2 avoided, that is over $100 US now that you could add to the $180 federal tax credit. And so very quickly you can see in that context that's almost $300 US per ton to support direct air capture. And so there are many people, as one example, looking at that as a financeable model, especially when you consider there's much installed infrastructure that you could leverage. And so all of the projects that I mentioned in my presentation this morning are commercial projects that take advantage and work with those existing policy tools. Again, not a one-size-fits-all. Many projects being put forth in Europe are supported by the European Commission's policy tools that are there. In the UK, they're supported by a contract for differences mechanism. And as we heard, there are different mechanisms, whether you're in the Middle East or in China or in various other regions. I think there is much that we can learn together in terms of what's the most efficient policy tools that can help support the financing. From my perspective, the role of governments, the role of policymakers is to dial in the policy that can close the gap from where the commercial cost and performance is now versus where the true costs are, until carbon mitigation is valued appropriately on fair commercial terms in markets, whether it's a stationary power market, whether it's a commodity market in terms of low carbon steel, low carbon cement, you know, until carbon reductions are appropriately valued, there will remain a role for policy to help close that gap. But the data suggests that there are, you know, over 200 projects that are now progressing around the world based on existing policy. My view is this, you know, the technology is adequately demonstrated. Now the conversation should be, how do we finance this on fair commercial terms? And how do technology providers, how do financial institutions, how to carbon market and people that facilitate those, how can we work together to find investable projects? Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tsukamoto. Thank you for your question. I would like to speak in Japanese. For your reference, I would like to give you some points from Nemoto, from JBIC. Now, we are financing one particular project, and this is an EOR CCS project. The oil price is being gained as an income source. So we have never experienced financing a pure dedicated CCS project, and this will be the challenge for us going forward. But I'm sure the portfolio of projects will be expanded in the future. And as you suggested, if we are to be involved in CCS projects, in what way should we go about in our due diligence procedure? Of course, EOR has a good track record, and there is an income from the oil. But to give you my personal view, the due diligence procedure in the banks have been changing, and we will be shifting towards a more forward-looking procedure. Even though it is not purely CCS risks proper, but if there is certain project, if we would like to reduce the risk of those projects becoming those who will be failing, we would like to reduce those risks involved for the possible failure in the future. So we would like to be able to have a risk analysis in a more forward-looking manner, so that we will be able to reduce such risks becoming stranded assets in the future. But I'm sure for CCS we will see a bright future, not just for the EOR projects, for the other projects as well.
Thank you very much. Non-EO, like for the pure CCS internationally, well, I was wondering as to how much of such projects are being launched. That was part of my interest.
Let me answer that too. And so for our data that we are tracking for the Institute, over 70% of the new projects are geologic storage for the sake of climate change mitigation with no enhanced hydrocarbon recovery. So historically, up to this point in time, you know, 21 of the 30 global operating projects have enhanced recovery. That's what made them commercially operable and financeable historically. Going forward, right, we see a trend that suggests people are focused on geologic storage just for climate change mitigation and not reliant on enhanced recovery. When I was in the Middle East talking with the chief technical officer of Saudi Aramco, and we heard from Mohammed, they have an aggressive project, you know, a large hub in Saudi Arabia, tens of millions of tons per annum in the next coming years. They are consciously choosing to do geologic storage for the sake of climate change mitigation, not to do enhanced recovery. From my perspective, we would expect that trend to continue. From a financial perspective, right, if you talk to the company that does the largest amount of enhanced oil recovery in the world, Occidental Petroleum, who is based in the United States, when they try to look at financing an EOR project, you're on a pro forma basis, on a cash flow basis, your revenue that you could expect for CO2 being sold to enhanced oil recovery depends on the price of oil. And they're risk adjusted, that's very difficult because that price is quite volatile. When you look at a business model that is based on a stable policy regime, if they put CO2 in the ground for the sake of climate change mitigation, they are guaranteed back by the sovereignty of the US government to get $85 per ton of CO2 permanently stored. Risk adjusted, that business model looks much better and more investable if the numbers, work appropriately. And from their perspective, having that certainty versus the uncertainty of beholden to an oil market is something very much of interest. And so I think globally we would expect those trends to continue. That does require that those policy tools are appropriately scaled and adjusted such that the finances work, such that investors can get an appropriate risk-adjusted return on their equity and their capital. And again, so you need policies that are tuned appropriately for the cost and performance of the market and for the local conditions, right? The storage costs vary depending on how good your geology is. If you're doing direct air capture, the costs of doing direct air capture vary depending on what is the cost of your low carbon energy required to drive that system. And from my perspective, you need policy tools regionally, locally, geographically, that are tuned to those appropriate market conditions to make CCS investable.
Thank you.
Questions and comments from the audience, please.
Thank you very much for your very interesting panel discussion. My name is Nan Wang from MUFG Bank. So I have a very general question focusing on the deployment of carbon kind of CCS projects. The thing is that the ongoing 45 megaton projects all over the world, of this world. So I'm wondering your opinion on these ongoing projects. The thing is that usually when a new technology deployed in the globally, for example, renewable energy is very similar. At the starting point is usually like cherry picking, like these are the low-hanging fruits. So we are cherry picking in this world globally and selecting this kind of projects that are workable at the current business or policy landscape. So I'm wondering what's your opinion on these ongoing projects? Are they cherry picking or are they the low-hanging fruits that we are doing our best at the current policy landscape, or there are still more potentials that still can be explored and further there are more low-hanging fruits for us to take. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and I think we can get a variety of responses from our panelists. From my perspective, the global set of operating commercial scale projects in the world today are all essentially first-of-a-kind projects at first-of-a-kind project cost. It would be wonderful if we can get the second-of-a-kind, third-of-a-kind, come down that cost curve, learning by doing, allow the due diligence to have more data points to better value the risks, the technology risks, to get better financing. All of that works to support accelerating deployment of CCS. From my perspective, the existing projects are based on where there was sufficient amount of supporting policy, where there was leadership from industry that wanted to be some of those first movers. I don't think they're cherry picking. I think there's much deployment opportunity going forward. And again, the technology will continue to improve by learning by doing, through advanced R&D, through better financing. But I think there's probably a number of perspectives to this question on the panel. Mohammed, do you want to start?
Yeah, I want just to add, when these projects started, and we all, I think, agree, we don't have a global or regional full policies, regulations, and finance and incentives to generate business models. So these projects were defined on like where it's feasible and a low-hanging fruit. For example, the projects in the UAE with the steel industry, we have a stream of CO2 of 85% concentration. It's a free, pure CO2. So ADNOC drove that project with the minimum cost for enhanced oil recovery, and that was a very successful project so far. They have been using it and they're injecting the CO2. So as Jared also said, each one of these are first of a kind. We would expect when we move forward, we have the better understanding of the technology, so the cost will go down because we repeat the same project again and again. And that will give us also the time to advance in the financing schemes and the policies. So hopefully when we have these, we start mitigating most of the risks. We will find mechanisms to engage the private sector. So we will see the projects coming forward, and then it's not necessarily dependent on enhanced oil recovery or the high CO2 concentration. If we have incentives and a proper business model, then we can deploy it for the power sector, diluted streams, and also direct air capture and others.
Thank you, Mohammed. Other things to add? From a AITA's perspective, it may be interesting, the expectation is the price of a ton of CO2 avoided will increase going forward, and that will increase the financeability of many projects that try to mitigate or reduce carbon. But other thoughts? Anything to add, please?
ですね、
On the part of IETA, in terms of international transaction, we would like to revitalize as much as possible. That is our intention. Therefore, CCS projects to be permitted and to be spread all over the world is what we would like to see happen. Now, if I may continue on what I said earlier, Shimura-san, you talked about liability in your last slide. So that is a risk that should be fully considered. But my personal view is that for the project, there is no significant liability. I don't feel that is the case because CO2 does not burn, it's not combustible. And even if there's leakage, it's not going to bring about a major disaster. That is not the case. But carbon credit will disappear. That is where we have to overcome. It's an insurance issue. But in terms of transportation, the oil pipeline is everywhere around the world. By the same token, CO2 pipelines could be all the world, and I don't think there is an issue in terms of safety. In terms of technology, I believe it is reliable, but appropriate assessment is required. And Nishioka-san mentioned that social acceptance is very important. If we have geological storage, it could be subject to earthquake risk. How can we guarantee that there is no such risk? That is a discussion that needs to be had. And against this backdrop, the CCS project, the reason why it is not spreading as a business is because in a run-up toward the start, initial cost is very high, and the profit upon recovery, cash flow generated, is not visible, is unclear. Therefore, the demand prevailing in the market and how much stability of this demand will have to be ensured. Otherwise, it will not be a viable project. So in that regard, in particular, for the injection of CO2, the technology is well established. But in terms of the CO2 sequestration and capture, on a large-scale commercial basis, low cost has not been demonstrated yet. Given the current circumstances, very high price setting will be required, and no one is going to be happy purchasing that. So it will have to be a system to compel a purchase. Otherwise, with technological innovation, significant cost reduction in the future has to be foreseeable. We need such a driver for the future. And once we have this in place, we can create demand. Then we will have a proper market to operate. This is what we hope will happen.
And just to add to that, there is no one cost number for CCS. It very much depends on where you are, what your storage geology looks like, what the cost of energy is to drive that. Just as a couple of examples, the cost of transport and storage in the United States, there is much that can be done, hundreds of millions of tons per annum, at less than $10 US per ton of CO2. If you go over to Europe, and you're talking about storage, taking CO2 from onshore Europe and storing it responsibly and durably and well under the North Sea, you're talking in costs on the order of $100 or 100 euro per ton. So that's a factor of 10 in cost just on the transport and storage there. In terms of capture costs, right, that varies tremendously as well. And we heard some data points from Xiaoliang in terms of, in the Chinese context, the relatively low cost all-in for CCS there versus in different regions, for example, in Japan, where it's simply more expensive because energy is more expensive, because land is more expensive, because there is not onshore storage. One would have to do that offshore, which is expensive. So again, not a one-size-fits-all answer. And policy tools need to be tailored for those specifics. Yep, another question in the middle.
Kind of an open question. My name is Ken Kuroiwa. I represent Marvin Corporation. So it's kind of an open question. The key is how to evolve the Japanese market. And I think it has been a consensus that we need a strong leadership from our public sector to set the standard. I think if someone has some insight to let our government to shift this needle, as a private sector, is it better off to go abroad and get exposed or invest in the so-called best practice technology and bring back to Japan? Or is it better off to really try to concentrate our resources to incubate something in Japan, a kind of so-called Japanese-made tech? Yeah, so as a direction, do you have any insight on which route we should take to really make things happen in this market? I know it's not a very easy question.
No, that's a great question, and I think maybe we can tailor that to our panelists that are here from Japan. Yukimi, do you want to start us off, and we can go down the line with just a short answer? That's a wonderful question. Thank you.
It is a wonderful question, but it's a tricky question at the same time. I think when it comes down to it, it's really who pays the costs. And so we do need a strong policy from the Japanese government to make sure that wherever we inject CO2, whether in Japan or in abroad, at least that the cost will be paid by whoever needs to be paid. And the rest is really economics. Is it cheaper to do it in Japan or cheaper to do it in the abroad? If the Japanese government provides enough financing in the early stage, while we're waiting for the other governments to provide the similar type of subsidies for their storage facilities, for instance, who knows? It's just timing, in my personal view. But again, the key is strong drive or incentives, at least, for the people, for the industries who needs to pay for the costs.
Yeah, thank you for that. Masaki, thoughts?
Thank you for your question. It's a good question. Cost, it's a very big issue. I think this is related to not only the Japan and not only Japan government, but all countries. We have to discuss about this issue in the for example, or international or discussion panel. For example, Russians, for example, there was a COP27. It's a very big chance to communication and discuss about the climate change issues all over the world. So I think the one topic CCS will we have to raise this CCS cost topics to that panel abroad, because how to manage the cost, it's a global issue, not only between the two countries. So, for example, this is similar to the market, I think. For example, a carbon credit market, a little bit different from the CCS, however. The carbon credit market, for example, it is a very big issue in the COP27 because of the Article 6 is related to the carbon market. Now, in the COP27, COP26, every country discuss about how to make the market of the carbon trading. It's a very similar issue, I think, in the cost on the cost of the CCS. We have to discuss these topics in the similar style between not only two countries, all over the world, because of the CCS CO2 issue is related to climate change. So how to manage, who will responsible to pay the cost, this issue is have to discuss in the international round table. So I think.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think, globally, to go from local optimization to global market optimization, that is in everybody's best interest. It's just very challenging to go there. But many people are trying. The Article 6 under the UNFCCC is hosting that discussion. And yes, much good work needs to be done. Yeah. Dr. Nishioka, do you have thoughts on this question?
Kuroiwa-san, thank you very much for the question. First of all, in the domestic market, carbon pricing is the first and foremost premise. And obviously, CO2 reduction must provide value, otherwise nobody would be encouraged to do that. So carbon pricing is a basic premise. That is the basis of the system that has been designed. Now, CO2 in Japan to be taken overseas. But the geological site is not abundant, is not everywhere where it is appropriate for CO2 storage. Therefore, the appropriate site for CO2 storage is subject to competition. Japanese companies will have to be able to win this competition. And JOGMEC will stand ready to provide support in terms of technological insight we have in identifying the appropriate sites. There are many challenges before us. The CO2 best location selection is going to be of utmost importance.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Takashi, do you have thoughts?
Well, let me just repeat. As for AIDA, well, if the international trade becomes active, we believe that it would be great. It may sound extreme, though. But it may sound extreme, but no matter where it is going to be, well, from the country where the cheapest carbon credit is provided, and if that is applicable to the NDC of your own country, then I believe that it would mean that the investment amount is going to be at the minimum level globally, and not only that, we would be able to work on as much GHG reduction as possible in the world level. Therefore, as long as it fits from the standpoint of the cost, in Japan we can work on the segmentation and store it in Japan, or we can choose to export it elsewhere. Or we can even choose to separate in the overseas and store there, and the credit can be purchased by Japan and use it for offset. Well, there might be different policies in each country, but in overall, I think it works the best. That is our basic stance. Though, having said that, it's not that. The premise here is that the system in the world would be optimal, and of course, each country has its own agenda. Not only that, the price competition, as to how the price competition would function and it would work out for the optimal GHG reduction, I think that's going to be the key here. Well, that's not really the direct response, but that would be my take.
Thank you for those thoughts. Mr. Kobayashi, do you have thoughts on this question?
Thank you very much. Well, I think all the points have been covered by prior speakers. But let me talk about in times of contingency, risk after contingency. And if there is it's captured in Japan and injection overseas, there is an interesting take that we have to consider. When injection is made overseas and there's leakage thereafter, and if it is carbon pricing applied in the country, what is going to happen? Is it a risk for a Japanese company in Japan, or is it an overseas event risk? So we need to organize our thoughts around this going forward. Well, it would have to be stipulated in the contract between the parties regarding risk. And then hedging might be required. Is it going to be the storage or the capture country? How risk can be hedged is an issue that needs further discussion.
Thank you very much for that. First and foremost, in relation to the question whether we should do this in Japan or the overseas, I think that was part of your question. Well, I think my answer would be both. That is because when we take a look at the future, the CCUS business can take place in two ways in Japan. One is the Japanese type hub and cluster model. The operator can operate that. Well, another format is to have the CCUS operation in the overseas, and that right is to be connected to Japan. So these are the two types, and we have to have both. And finally, I think we would be able to achieve the carbon neutrality in 2050, according to my understanding. Well, to do this in overseas physically, what we can do is to export the CO2 physically to Asia and to store it, or at the end, the carbon credit can be applied to the NDC as well. But somehow, after we are able to deal with this, I think we would be able to make contribution to the achievement of the NDC. Such is one possibility, according to my understanding. But initially speaking, how would the Japanese, the CCUS can start off? Well, in the end, carbon pricing and societal change would be required in the end, but that requires lots of time for that to happen. Therefore, as for the first project, I think the strong policy, the support would be required, so that the model, as a model project, it can be conducted. So the Japan type CCS hub cluster and can be launched in several cases. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for that question. And as we can see, you know, this is a very complex topic. I think when I look back at our day's conversation, and Seki-san from METI presented, you know, here's the CCUS policy. It's interesting to set that in the broader context of how does CCUS in the CCS policy fit into a broader decarbonization policy? You know, from a Japanese perspective, what can be done just within a sovereign nation in a country? What can be done to optimize the strategy and the approach in terms of bilateral work and collaboration, whether it's hydrogen, you know, in projects between Japan and Australia, whether it's importing ammonia as an opportunity to decarbonize and partnering with countries in the Middle East. You know, to me, that's the right way to frame the discussion that then helps inform how do you tune those policy tools to support the appropriate role of CCS. I think as we heard from our panelists and specifically from Yukimi and you know, the other folks from the finance sector on the panel, right? At the end of the day, all of these things need to fit together. It has to be investable. It has to be financeable. That has to be viewed through a risk-adjusted basis in terms of, you know, is there an appropriate return for investment in CCS versus other opportunities to invest, you know, limited resources. And to me, this is a conversation that requires active discussion from public officials, whether it's from METI or from Ministry of Environment. It requires, you know, conversation and discussion, not just nationally, but internationally and globally, you know, through conversations like what we heard in terms of Article 6 discussions, for conversations like we heard in terms of international markets for CCS, both compulsory and voluntary markets, right? And how all of these pieces fit together. How can we learn from each other? How can the CCS community better inform the financial sector in terms of here's the techno-economics and the cost and performance of where CCS is. Here's where the risks are. Technology risk, integrated full value chain risk, right? There's a need for the CCS community to have that conversation with the finance sector so they can learn for us. There's also a need for the CCS community to engage and learn from banks in terms of how do they view these topics. How do they view CCS and the risks associated with technology, with the storage, with the long-term liability, with the cross-chain value risk, right? These are all conversations that need to be had, and I think it's forums and discussions like we are in today where we can get leaders from the government and public sector, leaders from the technology sector and technical expertise, leaders from the finance community, from, you know, the CO2 markets community, to come together and have these discussions that we can all learn from each other. All of the climate math says CCS needs to be a part of our overall solution. Time is not on our side, so the more that we can work together, learn from each other, to find ways to make CCS financeable and investable. That's how we will all work together to accelerate deployment, to get commercial deployment at scale, to get from those 40 million metric tons where we are today to that gigaton scale of deployment that all of the modeling suggests will be required to help meet our sustainable development goals. So with that as sort of my summary of this conversation, I want to thank the panelists for your part of the discussion today. Could you please all join me in a round of applause for the panelists? Thank you very much. And with that, I will turn the program back over to Hiroshi.
Thank you very much indeed. I would like to thank all the panelists for having a discussion for such a long time. Just like that, we have been proceeding with this forum, and we have just completed all the agenda items, and now the time is getting close to an end. Today, I would like to show my heartfelt appreciation to all the speakers and panelists for having the lecture and the discussion. Not only that, I would also like to present my gratitude for the people who are here and people who are connecting online from all over the world throughout the forum for paying attention and joining us. As usual, I would also like to thank all the translators for providing us with the translation service. Thankfully, we have been able to further deepen our understanding. I would also like to extend my gratitude for the staff members at the venue for providing us with such a care. CCS as I believe, is now ready for a further advancement supported by the current tailwind. In order to stop the global warming, we need to make sure that we reduce the frequency of the extreme climate event so that we do not end up succeeding at issues to our the children and grandchildren. Up until now, we have been focused on to technological method when it comes to the past presentations. But now, I believe that the CCS is now ready to be commercialized. Therefore, we decided to invite over the people from the finance sector so that we can learn about the associated risks and what sort of solutions are available at this time. I really do hope that today's discussion had led to further deepening of your understanding. We, the GCCSI, would like to continuously work on advocacy activities and sharing of the information to connect the world. We are more than ready to exert further effort, for which I would like to ask for your kind continued support. Well, with this, we would like to close today's session. We are looking forward to doing this next year, and we very much look forward to seeing you once again. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us, the Japan CCS Forum 2022 today. There are housekeeping announcements. Please make sure to leave the translation receiver either on your desk, on your chair, before you leave the venue. Furthermore, we have a box available at the door. Please fill in the survey sheet and submit the survey. We are going to have the networking event at Hawaii. Those of you who have registered already, we are going to open up the registration desk soon, where you are kindly asked to go through procedures. Thank you very much for joining us for such a long time today. Thank you.